We're in Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 12. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters, having been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, dare to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear. Some proclaim Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I have been put here for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering and my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. It's my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, and I don't know which I prefer. I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Since I'm convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in faith, so that I may share abundantly in your boasting in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. Now, there's a passage in this text that I know is sort of the elephant in the room, and every time I engage with this particular passage, there are so many questions about the afterlife. That passage, in the older translations, it said to be apart from the body is to be at home with the Lord. Some of you have remember that translation. And so a question that comes up whenever we deal with this passage is the question of what happens to us after we die. Where did my loved ones go? I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to call your attention to Proverbs chapter 29. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 25, provides us with a proverbial truth that I think undergirds everything Paul is testifying to in the passage we just read together. It claims the following. Proverbs 29, verse 25. The fear of others lays a snare, but one who trusts in the Lord is secure. The fear of others lays a snare, but one who trusts in the Lord is secure. During the last 2 years together, we've spoken a great deal about fear. In June of 2019, in a sermon from Jeremiah chapter 2, entitled, "What Time Is It?" we discussed fear as an idol that has taken over the worship of a great many people, maybe most people in our time. In February of this year, in a sermon from John 12, verses 9 to 26, entitled "The Son of David," we discussed the idol of fear as a hydra with many heads that have a way of regrowing themselves even after we chop them off. Some of you might remember that message. On both of those occasions, we discussed faith in God as the only way to truly be free from the idol of fear. In many ways, today's message is a continuation of those messages, but it's much more personal. Paul is no longer talking about fear as a concept or as an ideology, but now personally, he's talking about people that use fear to control others. And Paul encourages the Philippians to be free from the fear of those who would use their fears to control their lives. If we're to be free, not only from the idol of fear, but from those who seek to wield its power over us, we must learn from Paul what Paul learned from Jesus. So these are our 3 points. We're going to talk about what it means to embrace isolation. We're going to talk about what it means to embrace competition. We're going to talk about what it means to embrace deterioration. These are the 3 things Paul had to embrace in order to shed the power of those who would wield fear. Let's look first at Paul's example and exhortation with respect to isolation. Look back at Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters, having been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, dare to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear. Now, I'm persuaded that at the time Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison in Rome, and that the situation that sent him there is described for us at the end of the book of Acts. Now, that's not universally believed. We all know Paul's in prison, but there's debate over where exactly he is in prison. But even if I'm not right that he's in Rome and that Acts describes how he got there, all of his imprisonments were for virtually the same reason. So we'll stick with Acts. It'll give us a way into this. And at the end of the book of Acts, Paul was arrested for teaching about Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the Jewish authorities wanted to stop Paul from sharing more and more about Jesus. And so their solution to the Jesus-Paul problem was to find a way to isolate Paul so that he could no longer share what he was sharing. And the best way to do that was to get him arrested. And they lived in the Roman Empire, and the Romans didn't like new religions. They were very tolerant of old religions, but they did not like new religions. And they did not like social unrest. Those were two things that would get their attention. So the Jewish authorities accused Paul of both things, of inventing a new religion and of causing social unrest. And that got the Romans' attention. They were successful. Paul was arrested. And after several ambiguous trials between, you remember Felix and Festus. If you haven't, you can read the end of the books of Acts. Paul realizes that this isn't going to work out well for him. And so he exercised his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. So Paul was sent from Judea to Rome to have his final trial in the empire's capital. And it would seem that the tactic of Paul's adversaries in Jerusalem had worked, right? I mean, he's no longer able to share the gospel in Jerusalem while he was imprisoned. And now he's gone off to Rome. There's no way he's going to corrupt any more of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. That's often the way powerful people work to silence their adversaries. They use justice and the systems that be to make sure that those saying things that they don't want said are silenced. It's as common a story as it is contemptible. And many have walked in the footsteps of Paul's opponents and treated their opponents in this way, and many more have walked in the footsteps of Paul himself and been misjudged. The world uses fear of these sorts of things, imprisonment, isolation, as a way to exert its power over us. And we must not allow those fears to dictate our responses or to dictate who we become. One means of control by fear, and the one that we're talking about now, is isolation. And you know this tactic well because you probably used it as parents. Isolation is a tactic used by nearly every authority throughout our lives. It begins today in young children with the practice of timeouts or go to your room. It proceeds into the teen years, most often with grounding, right? Isolates the teenager from sometimes their technology or their friends or their freedom. It continues in adulthood now. This is a new thing. We're just getting used to it. When people cancel you on social media, it's a type of isolation. It's trying to cut you off from all of your contacts. And if it gets bad enough, Twitter will delete your account. Facebook will censor you. That's another type of isolation happening today. In cases that are more serious to the state, we know that we can be put under house arrest or even put into prison. And even in prison, it can progress into what many people think of as the worst example of social isolation, which is involuntary solitary confinement. So these sorts of punishments where we are isolated from others, they happen throughout our lives. And in every case, they're intended to take our freedom, our autonomy, and sometimes even our dignity. And they are intended to make us afraid to do whatever it was that got us into that situation to begin with. It's no wonder we fear them. We're afraid of these things. It's quite understandable that we fear isolation. Even God said at the beginning that it's not good for the human to be alone. And it's reasonable to want to fight for our freedoms by resisting them. All those things are normal. But I want you to notice that that was not the example of Paul. And it was not what he had learned from Jesus. Somehow Paul was not afraid of being isolated, of having his freedom taken away. Nor did he tremble before the power of those who would threaten him with it. Paul allowed the death and suffering of Jesus to transform isolation into honor. Paul knew he had done nothing. Now, if you do something to earn your imprisonment, you're in a different place. But Paul knew he had done nothing to deserve his imprisonment. And so he continued to worship God. He continued to rejoice and continued to seek opportunities to share the teachings of Jesus in spite of it. Now, what about Jesus' story made Paul think it was honorable to have this happen to him? Why didn't he rail about the injustice of it? Why didn't he rail about the unfairness of it? Why didn't he try and get the laws changed? Well, maybe he didn't have opportunity to do that. He did live under Caesar. But he also had seen Jesus walk these very same steps. Jesus had been arrested. Jesus had been censored by his peers. And Jesus had been persecuted. And so Paul didn't expect any less for himself. He didn't expect to live in a world that was different than the world Jesus lived in. So instead, Paul considered it an honor to walk where Jesus had walked. This is what Jesus experienced. It's an honor to walk in his footsteps. That's how Paul thought about it. And his continued obedience to Jesus, even in the midst of his imprisonment and his unjust accusations, created opportunities for the gospel to spread. Amongst his jailers, who now knew about Jesus because Paul was unlawfully imprisoned, and amongst the broader population of Rome, because once the followers of Jesus in Rome saw what happened to Paul, Paul says that now they were emboldened to share the gospel without fear. By embracing his isolation as part of the journey to which God had called him, the fear that the powers that be meant to use to silence Paul had no power over him at all. Like Paul, if we want to be free from the fear of the world and free to follow Jesus no matter our circumstances, we have to embrace the things that the world would use to scare us into submission. And isolation is one of the most powerful tools used by the world to silence the people of God and anyone who destabilizes their world. So long as we are afraid of losing our freedom, so long as we are afraid of being imprisoned, we are in the control of the world. So long as we fear these things, they will have control over us. Are you afraid? To be free from the control of the world, Paul demonstrates not only that we must embrace isolation and the curbing of our liberty, but we must also embrace competition, and I want to explain that. In other words, we have to embrace the reality that others will often use our sufferings and our hardships against us and for themselves. Look at Philippians chapter 1 now in verse 15. Some proclaim Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I've been put here for the defense of the gospel. The others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering and my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true. And in that, I rejoice. Now, many of you know in preparation for messages, I read a lot of commentaries. And as I was reading those commentaries, the one that stood out to me the most is one by Gordon Fee. And in his commentary on Philippians, he argues that Paul was wrestling in this passage with folks that today we would call sheep stealers. Do you know what that is? Sheep stealers? Ministries that try to persuade a person to leave one ministry and come to another ministry in the same area. Sheep stealers. That's what Fee thinks is going on. His best guess is that there were folks in Rome who were using Paul's imprisonment as an indictment against him so that they could gain more disciples for themselves. Now, Paul doesn't say that they were teaching a false gospel. If they were, you know he would rail against it like he did in Galatians, like he did in 1 Corinthians. So they seem to be preaching the gospel as Paul understands it, but they were doing it not out of service to Christ, but out of some desire to self-promote. Now, I don't know if Fee is right about that, but his is the most persuasive argument I read, so I'm going to stick with it. Another way that the world tries to control us is by turning our limitations and challenges into advantages for themselves. Whatever trial you or I may face, somebody is likely to use it for their own advantage. The fear of this and the righteous indignation that these behaviors often elicit from us are means by which we can be controlled. Paul refused to give in to these things. And because he wasn't afraid of having his ideas taken or his identity stolen or the fruits of his labor come into somebody else's barn. Because he wasn't worried about that, he was free from their power over him. All of us fear the tarnishing of our reputations. That's how cancel culture works. We fear other people prospering off of our hard work and our ingenuity. We fear the theft of our ideas, the theft of our identities, the theft of our efforts. And those fears that you carry with you that are perfectly normal can be used to control you. Paul learned a better way from Jesus. Paul's vision was the spread of the teachings of Jesus. He was not interested primarily in receiving credit for the gospel or its spread. He wasn't interested in achieving some personal success that he could brag about at a conference. Jesus had showed him what it looks like never to seek one's own glory, but to seek always the glory of the Father. And so Paul was free to rejoice. While he was put in prison, his platform was pilfered, his messages were plagiarized, and his disciples were taken away. He rejoiced. If you and I are to be free from the control of the world as Jesus was and as Paul was, we have to release our fear of being outcompeted. We have to release our fear of being outwitted. If we can embrace personal loss for the good of the gospel of Jesus, we too can be free. And finally, to be free from the control of the world, not only do we have to be willing to embrace isolation and the curbing of our freedom, not only do we need to embrace the reality of being outcompeted and outwitted, but we also have to embrace deterioration and decline. Look at Philippians 1, verse 18, the second part of it. Yes, Paul writes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. It's my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, and I don't know which I prefer. I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Since I'm convinced of this, I know that I'll remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy and faith, so that I may share abundantly in your boasting in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. Now, the outcome of Paul's prison stay was uncertain. He didn't know what was going to happen. He might have been executed. He might have been punished physically and then set free. I guess there's a small chance he could have just been released. Whatever the outcome, Paul would most likely have received physical discipline of one sort or another, the type that killed him or the type that reminded him not to upset Roman society. In either case, his future in the flesh was not ideal. He didn't have a lot to look forward to if he didn't want to suffer. And yet Paul was confident that whatever the outcome, it would prove beneficial for him. What a statement that is. If he was executed, he would be with Jesus. If he was flogged and released, he'd be able to continue his mission of sharing the teachings of Jesus, and he might even have opportunity to visit the Philippians in person again. Both of those options for Paul, whether he was executed or tortured and released, worth rejoicing over. Really? Isn't there another way, like that God could just free you from prison and avoid all that? And yet, Paul confesses that if he could choose one of those options, selfishly, if he could be selfish, he would choose execution. Because his whole life was about finally entering into the presence of Jesus. But he saw that that was selfish to want that, and so he suspected God would set him free, so he could continue to serve the church. What a strange confession, right? I mean, was Paul suicidal? If this happened today, should we get him a therapist? Should the Philippians have looked into, called Focus on the Family and found out where some Christian therapists were and gotten Paul into treatment? Not at all. The gospel of Jesus had transformed everything for Paul. There were no dead ends for him. Every end for a normal worldly person was a door for Paul to walk through. Suffering had become a way to identify with Jesus, who walked a road of suffering. Unjust arrest had become a way to identify with Jesus, who, though he was innocent, he was condemned as a criminal. being misrepresented, mischaracterized, and being robbed of his ingenious ideas, and all of his followers have all become ways for Paul to identify with Jesus. Same thing happened to him. To be flogged has become a way to identify with Jesus, who was flogged before his crucifixion. To live in whatever measure remained an opportunity to serve Jesus by continuing to share his teachings and carry on his mission in the world. And to die had become a doorway for Paul into the presence of Jesus. Paul was not afraid of physical suffering, of physical decline, or even of death. Because for Paul, watching his body fall apart was like waiting for Christmas to come when you're 5. Because the day that process ends, Paul expected would be the greatest day of his life. It's a different way of thinking, isn't it? The world uses your fear of suffering and deterioration and death as a way of controlling you. Those fears make you slaves. So long as we fear these things, we are in the world's control and at the mercy of those who would sell us elixirs to cure us of the things that we fear. But if we can see life's road the way Paul had learned from Jesus to see it, we will be free. When I was reading in that commentary I mentioned earlier by Gordon Fee, he showed the Greek of the phrase, to live as Christ and to die as gain. It's a beautiful phrase in the Greek. And then he went on to reflect about it, and he said, so often we say these words, but almost no Christians live like they're true. We cling to life and to safety and to security and to health and to prosperity. Like grim death, we hold to them. What would it really look like to live as though Christ were all that mattered, and to look forward to death as a type of reward for a life lived following Jesus? It's a different way of imagining the world. We quote this. We sang it earlier. Do we believe it? How would your life change if you believed that? If your life, whatever it is you do, whether you are a tradesperson or you work in a hospital or you work as a salesperson or in some sort of a white-collar job, or if you work with people in customer service at Walmart or as a restaurant, no matter what you do, what would it look like to imagine that everything you do in life, Jesus is what matters? Like Paul, to find opportunity to share your testimony with him everywhere you are. We'd be different, wouldn't we? And how would we approach death if we thought of death as a reward for a life of faithfulness, the way Paul did? I think it would transform everything about us. And the reason I think it's important that we're having this conversation today is because right now fear is ruling the world. Fear is driving the next election. Doesn't matter what party you are, both are selling the same thing. We will rescue you from the things you fear. Fear is put before us as the idol to which we must all bow, and we are all seeking a priest who can mitigate our fears. Fear is the real God ruling our country at present, and it's not surprising. It's a fearful time. And right now, those who are in power will prey on you through your fear. If we are to be truly the followers of God, to follow Jesus, we have to be ready to lose our freedom. We have to be ready to be isolated. Maybe God is teaching us right now what the future will look like when Christianity is no longer the game in town. Right now, we're all isolated because of sickness, but it may come a time that those people of faith are isolated for other reasons. We don't know what's coming. But if we can embrace isolation and the curbing of our liberty and realize that this is a way to identify with Jesus and we can still be faithful through it, we'll be free from the fear of it. If we can embrace the idea that other people will always take advantage of our weakness, characterize what's happening to us in our lives as a reason to distrust us or to dismiss us, If we can embrace that that's exactly what happened to Jesus, and so that is likely to happen to his followers, it's not a strange thing that it's happened, it's quite to be expected, then we can be free from the fear of it. And if we can embrace the idea that deterioration and decline and even dying are part of the road Jesus walked, and it's a road for people of faith that lead to eternal life. So though we would rather not walk it, we do not have to fear it. Everything ends on earth. But every ending on earth for those who have faith in Jesus is a beginning. If we can shed our fear of these things, those who would control us by our fear will lose their power over us. And like Paul, we can rejoice in the curbing of our liberty, because different people will have access to the Christian message through that than had it before. We can rejoice that other people might use our weaknesses as a reason to promote themselves. So long as the gospel is spread, who cares whose idea it was or whose message it was? And if we can embrace decline, then the fact that we're declining will lose its power over us. And we'll begin to realize that the more we fall apart, the closer we get to the door behind which stands Jesus. And this is what the gospel means in 1 John when he tells us that perfect love drives out fear. If we could truly see what Jesus sees, what Paul saw, we would be free in every circumstance, and no one could control us. If we submit, it's because we choose to submit, as we should, but not because we're afraid. If we are arrested, we can rejoice. Why? Because we like being unlawfully in prison? No, because Jesus was arrested, and praise God, I get to walk in his footsteps. Do you see how it changes everything? What does it mean to say, to live is Christ and to die is gain? It's a radical transformation of everything the world fears. A radical transformation of all the philosophies and all the principles that support everything you have ever known in your life. This is a special day for the church. It's a warm-up. According to Revelation, it's a warm-up for Christians. And if you can learn to embrace these things, no one but God will have power over you. That's the joy of the gospel, and he invites you to it.